If you've ever seen any sort of media featuring hillbilly characters, you've probably seen them. Log cabins with a janky stovepipe protruding from a split shingle roof. Crude lean-tos made of rough-hewn planks. Despite their modest appearance, did you know that these mountaineer houses are actually part of an architectural style steeped in the tradition and culture of the Ozarks? Today we're going to be taking a look at that style. Let's talk about Ozark Vernacular architecture. Most of the information that I reference for discussing architecture comes from the 1994 book Ozark Vernacular Houses, a study of rural home places in the Arkansas Ozarks, 1830 to 1930, by Sizemore. This is a very thorough look into the topic, and if you're interested in learning more about Ozark architecture, this is the reference material that I would most recommend. Sizemore documents 6 traditional and 3 less traditional styles of houses in the book. So these are the styles that I'm going to focus on here. The 6 traditional styles are the single pin, double pin, saddlebag, dogtrot, central hall cottage, and eye house. The 3 non-traditional styles are the bent house, prow house, and pyramid roof house. Starting with the single pin house. This is perhaps the most stereotypically hillbilly of all the house types. Single-pin houses are one-room cabins that are less than 2 stories, which might make you think I'm just being weird about saying 1 story, but actually a lot of these houses had a loft that could be used as a sleeping area. They're often square, but sometimes more elongated and rectangular. Single-pin houses were almost always built from logs, and they were usually temporary houses. As the residents settled further onto their new land, they might choose to add on to the single-pin cabin or repurpose it as a barn. Most single-pin houses had a small lean-to type shed attached to the rear. Newer ones may have had stove flues, but the original ones had an external stone chimney on one of the gabled ends. On basically all of these houses, the front door would be beneath the eaves, aligned with the roof line, perpendicular to the gables. Now, if you add on to a single pin house, what do you have? If you said a double pin house, you're absolutely right. Double pin houses were easily built by adding a second room on to a single pin house on the end opposite the chimney. However, this wasn't actually that common, and it was more common for a double pin house to be built all in one go. The double pin house is typically 1 story and consists of 2 adjoining rooms of approximately equal size. While there is a connecting door in the dividing wall, each room also has a front door. These 2 front doors added cross ventilation, an easy fire escape, and additional privacy when making essential trips outside during the night. This type of house also tended to have an exterior stone chimney and lean-to shed additions at the back of the building. The saddlebag house is a variation of a double pin house. The same single-story construction consisting of 2 adjoining rooms of about the same size. However, the key difference is the chimney. While the double pin house has an external stone chimney, the chimney in a saddlebag house was right in the middle, between the 2 rooms. Saddlebag houses weren't especially common in the Ozarks, but they were fairly common further north. In fact, when I was looking for pictures of saddlebag houses, it was hard to find them from Arkansas, but there were quite a few from North Carolina and up in the Midwest. That probably has something to do with one of the key features of a saddlebag house. They were fairly easy to heat, with the centrally located fireplace capable of warming both rooms at the same time. Additionally, sleeping quarters were often located in a loft, made even warmer because warm air rises and would collect beneath the roof. Another type of 2-room house was the dogtrot. However, the name dogtrot was often considered pejorative by residents of these houses, who sometimes preferred to call them hallway houses. Dogtrots had 2 equal rooms joined by a common gable roof over an open, central, floored hall, from which the rooms were typically entered. They tend to be symmetrical and are rarely more than 1 story tall, the Jacob Wolf house being a well-known exception. The rooms were typically square, and the hallway between was usually around 8 to 10 feet wide. In some ways, a dogtrot was the opposite of a saddlebag house. While saddlebag houses were built for cold areas where your primary priority was to get your house warm, dogtrots were built for warm areas where you wanted as much ventilation as possible, which would be provided by the open passageway between the two rooms. Conversely, they were very difficult to heat. Then again, that wasn't a big priority for many residents of dogtrot houses. In fact, the breezeway could even be used as an outdoor room in good weather, and occupants might sleep out there in the summer. Dogtrots are more common in the most isolated areas, as those in the more populated areas tended to eventually close off their breezeways for added privacy, thus creating the next type of house that I want to talk about. Central hall cottages were basically the more sophisticated and formal version of a dogtrot house. Like dogtrots, they were usually one room deep and 1 story tall, consisting of 2 equal-sized rooms separated by a central hall. However, while the hall in dogtrots was open to the elements, in a central hall cottage the hallway had been enclosed. They were more common in areas that were more wealthy or along main transportation routes. However, central hall cottages only enjoyed a brief period of popularity, with the majority of them having been built between 1851 and 1895. The last of our traditional houses is the I house. Unlike the other houses that I've discussed so far, I houses were typically 2 stories. Each floor was 2 rooms wide and 1 room deep. I houses were very rare in rural areas, as they were typically constructed by more wealthy landowners. The prevalence of I houses is typically directly tied to the prosperity of an area, especially when those houses were not made of cheap and readily available wood, but of more expensive and labor-intensive brick. Now for the 3 non-traditional house types. The first of these is called a bent house. Bent houses have a T or L shape. While they were usually 1 story, having multiple floors was not especially out of the ordinary. Like central hall cottages, they enjoyed a very brief span of popularity, with most being built between 1900 and 1917. As they were more often tied with wealthier landowners, they were more common on the Springfield Plateau than in the Boston Mountains. A prow house has 3 rooms. 2 are laid out side to side like in a double pin house, but the 3rd projects forward from the center. Like bent houses, prow houses were also typically 1 story, but it wasn't uncommon to see them taller. Prow houses often had porches that wrapped around the front projection. The front door usually went into the protruding room rather than into either of the 2 double pin type rooms. As is becoming a common refrain, prow houses tended to be found in more prosperous areas of the Ozarks. Finally, we have the 1-story pyramid roof house. It feels a lot like the name describes this building. It's a boxy, square building, very similar to the Creole cottages of Louisiana. They consist of 4 rooms without a central passageway. Built between 1910 and 1930, they come at the end of the line for Ozark Vernacular architecture. In fact, they can be seen as a transitional style bridging the gap between the region's traditional houses and the craftsman-style bungalows that would soon flood the region. There's one more thing I want to talk about. One of my favorite parts of Ozark Vernacular architecture. Let's go on safari for a moment and talk about Ozark giraffes. Now, I'm not about to break news to you about there being some long-forgotten escaped herd of giraffes running loose in the hills. Ozark giraffes are buildings. Ozark giraffes are so named because the patchwork of stone on them is in colors and patterns that are said to resemble a giraffe. They're thought to have first appeared around 1910, but gained popularity during the 1930s due in part to various things, including Missouri Agricultural Extension bulletins describing how to build houses from native stone. Another important factor was the more widespread availability of Portland cement, which was used to adhere the rock to wooden frame buildings. This marked the first time that the excessive amounts of surface rock in the Ozarks could be put into real use in house construction. A common misconception about Ozark giraffes is that they're solid rock. The rocks are actually just a veneer. Stone, typically limestone in the east and sandstone in the west, would be cut into slabs that were between 1.5 and 3 inches thick and flat. Then the stone veneer would be glued to the frame with mortar, which was almost always painted, usually white. The stone veneer
And now back to our calendar and a group of
Next week we gotta pick a different word.
would serve as extra insulation on the houses. However, by the mid-20th century, Ozark giraffe construction was a thing of the past. By the 1960s, the style had declined due to labor costs being relatively more expensive than modern construction methods. This is because things like aluminum siding were able to be mass-produced and installed with relatively little training. This is understandable, but unfortunate, as the unique characteristics of every Ozark giraffe just isn't something you can really get with modern mass-produced products. But that's how history works sometimes, I guess. Well, if you'd enjoyed this video, please give a like, leave a comment, consider subscribing, and check out some of the other videos on my channel. If you'd like to hear even more about this topic, check out my podcast, Mapstronaut Bonus, that is available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, Breaker, Pocket Casts, and Radio Public. This has been Mapstro. Thank you for watching.